We are going to be in the Gospel according to St. Mark the Evangelist, the 5th chapter. And when we pick up, we're actually going to pick up in verse 21. Now, as you're turning there, we have been engaged in a long study of the Synoptic Gospels. And we've covered all kinds of different things in our study of the Synoptic Gospels. In fact, it wasn't last week because we were kind of snowed out last week, but it was the week before that we did a whole recap on everything that we had talked about. Of course, we spent most of that time kind of in the early stages, and then we rushed everything at the very end because that's kind of how it goes. But one of the things that we've been looking at before we got into the Christmas season, the Advent season, we were looking at this series of miracles as it is presented both in Mark and in Luke. These same miracles are presented in the same sequence, both in Mark and in Luke. And we have been looking at these 4 different miracles and identifying what they mean, what is being demonstrated, what is being shown by these various miracles. The first one we saw was how that Jesus stilled the wind and the waves as they sailed across the great sea there, the Sea of Galilee, and a great storm rose up. And it says that Jesus said, "Peace, be still." And the winds and the waves, they immediately calmed, and everybody was astounded. And in that, Jesus is demonstrating, of course, his power, his authority over the natural world, over the created world, when he is able to control the weather, as it were. And then we go from there and we see the immediate next story is Jesus landing on the other side there of the sea. And immediately there is, according to Mark and Luke, a demon-possessed man. And according to Matthew, there was 2 demon-possessed men who ran up on Jesus. And they had this little confrontation. And in the end, Jesus ended up casting out a legion of demons out of this man. And they went into the swine and they ran off the hill and they all died. This man, though, he was delivered. He was sitting and clothed and in his right mind. And it says the people, when they saw that, they were afraid. And they asked Jesus to leave. But in that story, Jesus delivering the demoniac, we see him exercising and showing his power not only over the material world, but also the immaterial world, the spiritual world. He shows he has power over that through that miracle as well. And then that's the last story we talked about in this series on the miracles, was about the deliverance of the demoniac. And so we are now going to pick back up in this story. It's been a long time. It's been a couple of months. It's been probably close to 3 months, maybe even almost 4, since we were in this study, because if you remember, we took a detour. We started talking about demons and the devil and all kinds of stuff. We spent a little bit of time on that, but now we're back. Now we're focused again. We're back on this story about the miracles, and the last thing we saw was Jesus delivering the demoniac. And it is from that point now that we are going to pick up with our story and how this goes here in Mark chapter 5, verse 21. And what I would like to do this evening is we're going to just kind of bop around and read the entire story as it is presented by Mark. We're only going to read the story as it's presented by Mark. We'll make reference to the other ones, but this is kind of a long story, and Mark is the most detailed, so he doesn't really leave out any details. We'll look at Mark, and then we'll pull from the other ones as we go. I want to look at an overview, and then we're going to look at the details of the story, break it down. We're going to offer a few interpretations, and we're going to move on with our lives and progress through the story. So any questions about where we've been and where we're going? That was like a 5-minute summary of like 5 months of work there. So I hope that we're all on the same page. I hope that we all are moving in the same direction. Let's go ahead and look at Mark chapter 5. Will somebody read? We're going to read this whole story, but we're going to break it into chunks. So will somebody please read verses 21 through 24?
When Jesus had crossed over again by boat to the other side, a great multitude gathered to him, and he was by the sea. And behold, one of the rulers of the synagogue came, Jairus by name. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet and begged him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter lies at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be healed, and she will live." So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him, and followed him.
Okay, and can we pick up now and read verses 25 through 29?
A woman who had had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians, and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. After hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. For she thought, if I just touch his garment, I will get well. Immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction.
Okay, and let's go ahead now and read verses 30 through 34.
And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" But his disciples said to him, "You see the multitude thronging you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" And he looked around to see her who had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction."
All right, and let's go ahead now and read verses 35 through 35 through 40. 35 through 40.
While he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official, saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe." And he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw commotion, and people loudly weeping and wailing. And entering in, he said to them, "Why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep." They began laughing at him, but putting them all out, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions, and entered the room where the child was.
All right, and let's go ahead and finish it up by reading verses 41 through 43.
Taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which translated means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded. And he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this, and he said that something should be given to her to eat.
All right, so that is the story. This story is actually two stories in one. But because it all happens in one story, we're kind of sandwiching them together, and we're going to treat them distinctly while at the same time treating this as one story, one event. Now, in this event, we see two different things. We have seen Jesus show his power and authority over the natural world. We have seen Jesus demonstrate his power and authority over the supernatural world. And in this story, we see him demonstrate his power and authority both over sickness and over death itself. Now, we're going to approach each one of these things in their due turn. But before we get to that, who can just kind of summarize this story? Let's summarize this story back now in just a few sentences. Let's talk about what is going on in this story. Let's break this down as just like kind of a summary. Who wants to start? How about this? How about I start? So the story begins when Jesus is returning from the other side, and he's going from Gentile country back into Jewish country. And then he is greeted, of course, by a whole gang of people. Now, he arrived back in Galilee. We're assuming he's in Capernaum. I don't have my map here. Hopefully you can remember, if you remember the geography of the Sea of Galilee, Capernaum is on like this side and the northern side, and where he sailed was over here. So he's traveling back to Capernaum, and all the Jews are there, and they meet him. And who comes up to him, and how does this develop?
The father comes up to him.
Okay, so the father, and the father happens to be more than just a father. Who is the father?
The Pharisee.
Okay, he may or may not be a Pharisee, but he definitely occupies a certain position in the synagogue. He is known as a ruler of the synagogue, or an administrator in the synagogue. That's important. We'll come back up to that in just a moment. But what does he ask him? Yeah, my daughter's sick. Come heal her. And of course, he knows that Jesus can heal her because Jesus at this point has been ministering for almost 2 years. Everybody knows who Jesus is. Everybody knows what Jesus can do. We've already studied and seen in the book of Mark how that people would bring all of the sick, all of the infirm to wherever Jesus was, and he would spend hours healing them and ministering to them and casting out devils. So everybody knows that Jesus has this power. Everybody knows that he's a healer and a deliverer. And so when he shows up, this man, this ruler of the synagogue, he has a sick daughter. He says, come help her. Jesus says, okay, and what happens?
As he's going, I think.
You're sidetracked.
Yeah, we have a holy interruption, as it were.
His garment gets touched.
Yes. And who was it that touched his garment?
The woman with the issue of blood, but her faith is what healed her.
Yeah, very good. So we have a woman, we don't know much about her. She's sick. She has a blood issue, a hemorrhage, I think Shannon's translation said. And yeah, she wanted to touch Jesus because she believed that if she even touched the hem of his garment, she would be healed. See, people knew that Jesus was powerful. They knew he was a healer. She had heard about Jesus, and she thought, I don't even really need to touch him. He doesn't even really need to touch me. If I can even touch his clothes, that's enough. If I can get close to this guy, there's so much power on him, I'll be healed if I can even get close to him. That's her mentality. And so what happens when she does that? She is healed. And she's, I'm sure, happy. And how does Jesus respond to this whole situation? Yeah, imagine that. Imagine being her, and you're like crawling on the ground trying to get there, and you touch him, and like you can feel in your body immediately that you're made whole, and you're like so happy, but then all of a sudden you notice he stopped dead. He stops right in his tracks, and you hear those words, "Who touched me?" And it's like, imagine you're like a kid with your hand in the cookie jar at that point, right? And of course she couldn't hide herself forever, so what happens?
She messes up.
Yeah.
What I'm amazed about is that the disciples around him said, well, what are you talking about? Who touched you?
Yeah.
There's all these people around you. How could you even ask who touched you? It's probably everybody.
Yeah, like look around. Everybody's touching you. What are you talking about?
So I'm amazed at the disciples multiple times when they're with Jesus and their reaction to what he says or does.
Yeah.
Jesus always knew who it was. Like the woman at the well, he told her how many times she'd been there. It wasn't that he didn't know. He wanted them to have faith enough to come out and admit it.
Yeah.
Bravery.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Giving them a chance to profess their faith, you know. It is a chance.
And he'd always say, it's because of your faith you have been able.
And that's what he told her, right? Your faith has made you whole. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, that translation, because that is an interesting translation. But he goes on, and what happens immediately after that? So he stops, he's interrupted. There's this whole issue in the street of this disgusting, dirty, unclean woman who touched Jesus in the middle of the street. And now, like, all of this is happening, and you're the ruler of the synagogue, and you're looking at this situation, and your daughter is dying, and here's Jesus, the healer, talking to this filthy, unclean woman, and you're just like, hurry up, what's wrong with you? And then, who comes up to them? The messengers, right? And what do the messengers say? Yeah, like, leave him alone. There's no need to bother the teacher. Your daughter is dead. And so if you're Jairus, if you're the synagogue ruler, you're devastated, right? You hear that. That's devastating news. But how does Jesus respond?
Do not be afraid any longer, only believe.
Yep, only believe. And so they go to the house. What happens at the house?
Hired hands are wailing.
Okay, there's people there. They're wailing. They're weeping. They are hired hands. Yes. We'll talk in detail about that as we come to it. And what does Jesus say? How does he respond to these people?
He said, what is going on here? You know, the child's not dead. She's sleeping, and y'all just need to get out.
Yeah. And then what?
Well, then he took the child by the hand and said the words that mean, girl, I say to you, arise. And that makes you think of the parallel story of Lazarus. You have the eyes.
Yeah. And she does, right?
Yep.
And what's the first thing that he does? She gets up, she walks, and what does Jesus tell him to do? Feed her. And I don't remember if it said this in Mark, but in one of the versions it actually says he told them to feed her. So my pastor always makes a joke about how you know this was like a preteen girl, because the first thing they did when she rose from the dead was say, get this girl some food. And anyway, that's a silly joke. I don't really understand it, but people seem to think it's funny. So that's what happened. That's basically the end of the story. That's how everything goes. Now, we've kind of looked at the overview. Now I want to break it down, and we're going to look at it piece by piece. And this week, our focus is going to be on the first story, the first half of the story, which is dealing with the woman with the issue of blood. Now, before we can actually get to that, though, we do want to take it in order. So we are going to be introduced to Jairus and what he's, however you say it, what he's about. And we're going to just kind of get into the details now and walk through this story kind of verse by verse and see what we can pull out of it. So, any questions before we get started on that? Go ahead.
It says that he ridiculed Jesus, and he said all of them were out. And he was disciples too. Did he make everybody
Yeah, and so to answer your question now, when you compare all of the different versions of the story, what it seems like is going on is Jesus brought with him 3 of his disciples to the house, Peter, James, and John, and then actually who got taken into the chamber where the woman was, the dead girl, was Peter, James, John, and the mother and father of the girl. And I think it's either Luke or Matthew that specifies that, but it was those 3, Jesus, and the parents of the girl, was everybody who was in there to witness it. Yeah. And there are several instances we see throughout the Gospels of Jesus taking along Peter, James, and John even beyond where he takes the other disciples. We do see several instances of that. This may be the first time we see that, where Jesus takes Peter, James, and John a little bit deeper than he takes even the rest of the disciples. So we're going to talk about that in detail, Lord willing, next week when we get to it. But just to answer your question for now, yes, it seems that it was Jesus, the 3 disciples, and the parents of the girl that were in there. Good question. Anything else? Let's just go ahead and start walking through it, beginning in verse 21. So the first detail that we pick up here is that it says Jesus passed over again by ship to the other side. So just to remember the chronology, the timeline here, he goes from teaching in Capernaum. It doesn't say he's in Capernaum, but we're assuming he's in Capernaum. He goes from there, he sails across the sea to the land of the Gadarenes, where he has an encounter with a demon-possessed man. And then he just immediately turns around and comes back. And that's where the story picks up. When he passed over again by ship to the other side, back to where he came from, there were many people gathered to him when he was close to the sea. So he arrives. There is a crowd that has gathered around. They're all there. They know who Jesus is. And then what we see, the very next thing, is that he is greeted by the ruler of the synagogue. It says in verse 22, behold, there came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and when he saw him, he fell at his feet. Now, there's a couple of things I want to say about this. First of all, what is this position, the ruler of the synagogue? He says that he's one of the rulers of the synagogue. This thing is mentioned in the New Testament in a few different places. It's mentioned here. There's a mention of the ruler of the synagogue in Luke chapter 13. And there are 2 mentions of the rulers of the synagogue, one in Acts chapter 13 and then another in Acts chapter 18. So there are a few instances of people referring to these rulers of the synagogue. In one story in Acts, there's a ruler of the synagogue who is converted to Christianity, and that's a big scandal. And then there's another one where the ruler of the synagogue is not converted, and they're trying to bring up charges against Paul. And when the Roman governor refuses to take up charges, all of the Jews then beat up the ruler of the synagogue right there in front of the courthouse. Okay, so there's a few instances of this position being mentioned in the New Testament, but basically what this was is it was an individual who was chosen to govern the affairs of the synagogue. Okay, and what is the synagogue? I don't know if we've talked too in depth about this in this class yet. We're going to talk about it right now. The synagogue, we need to understand, was like the center of Jewish community. In any town where Jews lived, the synagogue was the center of the community. Imagine for a moment that we lived in a town. And in that town there was a school. And in that town there was a church. Only one church. One school, one church, one courthouse. Imagine that we all lived in a town where there was one charity spot like U-How where they gave out food, and there was one bank, all of these things. And imagine for a moment if all of these things were inside of one building. And imagine there was one guy who was in charge of all of that. That's the ruler of the synagogue.
Mayor.
Yeah, it's more than that, right? It's more than the mayor. He's the mayor and the president of the bank and the superintendent of the school and the leader of religious worship services. He's the main judge in the system of law that exists among the Jews. There, in any Jewish community, the ruler of the synagogue was the head of the central institution of Jewish life.
He wasn't a priest, though?
Not always.
Okay, he could have been.
Yeah, he could have been a priest, but remember, at the synagogue, priestly functions didn't really happen. There were no sacrifices that happened at a synagogue. There was nothing like that because all of that happened at the temple exclusively. So, but the synagogue, it was like a church, it was like a school, it was like a bank, it was like a courthouse, it was like all of these different things in the community, and the ruler of the synagogue was charged with overseeing and administrating all of that. Okay, so the ruler of the synagogue, it's a very important position. It's a very powerful position. It's a very respected position. Anybody who was the ruler of the synagogue, they would be very well versed in Jewish law. They would be very well versed in tradition. They would be very well versed in all of the different rituals and all of the things that were necessary for ceremonial purity and etc. Who is this ruler of the synagogue? In a word, he's the most important guy in the community. He's the most powerful man in the community. That's who the ruler of the synagogue is. Everybody knows him. Everybody respects him. He is the man around this place, basically. And what does it say that this ruler of the synagogue did when he saw Jesus? That it fell at his feet. Now, do you guys remember how the demon responded when it saw Jesus on the other side of the lake? When he saw Jesus on the other side of the lake, it says that the demon ran up to him and did what? What was that? Fell down at his feet. Worshipped him, some of the translations say. And so, yeah, that's a very interesting thing. When we see one story after the other, you see a demon falling down at the feet of Jesus, and then we come to the ruler of the synagogue having a very similar response, falling down at the feet of Jesus when he sees him. But it is interesting to note, we do need to note this, the word that is used to describe what the demoniac was doing was the word that is often translated as worship. And it is the word, well, it escapes me right now, but it's where we get the word prostrate from. So he fell prostrate at him. This is the word that is used to describe the behavior of the demoniac. Something different is happening as it describes the behavior of the ruler of the synagogue. It's not saying that he prostrated. It's not using the same word. It literally says he fell at his feet. Like it uses all of the words. Fell at feet, right? So there's a different word. It's not saying the same exact thing as it was saying about the demoniac, but it is saying the behavior was very similar. Where one, it used the word for worship. Here it's saying he literally fell at his feet. And that's just a difference that I noticed. It's not like it's the same word, but it is a very similar idea that's happening. In fact, if you read the account in Matthew, it does say in Matthew that the ruler of the synagogue worshipped Jesus. It uses the same term for fell at his feet, that word where we get prostrate from. So Matthew says that the synagogue ruler worshipped Jesus, fell at his feet. Mark uses a different word. Luke uses a different word, but it still communicates the same idea. He humbled himself in the presence of Jesus. He threw himself at Jesus' feet. This is basically saying he threw himself at the mercy of Christ, right? In desperation. You can imagine how desperate someone would be throwing themselves at the feet of another person, begging them for mercy. This is an act of desperation that we are witnessing here. Any thoughts or comments or questions about that idea?
Just reading this, I did not see this faith in Jairus as I did in the woman, because he said, "Come and lay your hands on her that she may be healed, and she will live." So I don't know if that "may be healed" was doubt or just the way that it was said.
Conditional. I read that as a conditional more than an expression of doubt. That's how I read that. I'm not saying that that's true. That's just how I read it. But it is interesting you bring that up. We read another story about a Gentile, a centurion, who had a sick kid. Do you guys remember that? How did the centurion handle that situation? What did he say?
Just send the word.
Just send the word. I am a man of authority, and I have people under authority, right? I know all you have to do is say it, and it's going to happen. And how did Jesus respond to that? Right. Behold this great faith. I haven't seen such a great faith in all of Israel. So we see that exercise of great faith from the centurion. He understood Jesus just had to say it. And so maybe that's being contrasted now with the faith of the ruler of the synagogue, where he still is of the mind that Jesus needs to come and to touch him in order that this thing may happen. Maybe there's some doubt under the surface there. So yeah, that's a good observation. Anything else?
I don't remember what happened when David fell at his feet. What did Christ do? I don't remember what happened.
Yeah, so I mean, if we back up and look at that story, what does it say?
It's not our time yet.
Yeah, so
He's come to torment us, it's not our time.
Yeah, it says he saw him, he came and worshipped him, and then the demon cried out, just as he said, it's not our time yet. And then it just says that Jesus asked him what his name was, and that they begged him to go into the swine, and Jesus let them go into the swine. So that's how the story.
Then the pig flew.
Yeah, and then pigs did fly right off the cliff. Very good.
I knew about pigs, but then I just didn't remember the one name.
Yeah, because they had a little conversation. Jesus said, "Who are you?" He said, "We are legion, or I am legion, for we are many. Please don't torture us, blah, blah, blah." And then Jesus said, "All right, go into the pigs." So there was a conversation there that took place. But so here's the situation. The ruler of the synagogue, very important person in the community, falls at his feet. Matthew says that he worshipped him using that same word. And then we see that comparison between the demoniac and the ruler of the synagogue, how both of them fell at the feet of Christ. Now, what does it say at this point? Let's see. Verse 24. Will someone read verse 24?
So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and followed him.
All right, so Jesus is going now with this guy, and there's lots of people, hundreds of people, maybe even thousands of people who are here, a great multitude thronging him. That means they're like all over. They're pulling, they're trying to grab him, they're trying to get close. You've seen when a famous person walks down the street, you see how we treat them, right? So this same exact kind of thing is happening to Jesus here. He's walking down the street and everybody wants a piece of him. Sick people, demon-possessed people, desperate people, right? Who are, go ahead, curious people. Yeah. And you think about kind of imagine if you were a person who was sick, or you had a family member who was sick or demon-possessed or something, and you've struggled with this your entire life, and there's a guy here who you know can heal you, who you know can fix it, and just the sheer desperation that you might feel at the situation, and the desire, the answer's right in front of you, you know. Desperation makes people act in a crazy way. And so he's dealing with that. He's being thronged by the crowds. Everybody wants a piece of him. And then what happens is this woman comes up, and she is described in verse 25 as a certain woman, which just means a particular woman. And she had an issue of blood, it says, for 12 years. Some of your translations may say different things. Hers said a hemorrhage. Some of them may say different things. At any rate, here was a woman who was bleeding. She had a chronic bleed for a long time. 12 years, it says. And I want to talk about this woman with the issue of blood. And I want us to understand kind of what that means and why that's a problem. So most people think that this issue of blood was like a lady menstrual issue, like an ongoing menstrual bleed kind of an issue. That seems to be what the problem that is being talked about here. And this is something actually that is, I guess in some degree common. It was at least common enough that there are laws in the book of Leviticus that address this very issue. So let's look at it. Let's go to Leviticus chapter 15 together. We want to put ourselves in the minds of first century Jews. And so right now we're reading about a story about a Jewish woman in the first century who had an issue of blood. And I want to know why that matters. Why is the author of this gospel even sharing that detail? Why is he saying that? What relevance is it that she has an issue of blood? Why does that matter? Well, we're going to find out. Leviticus chapter 15. And we're going to begin in verse 19. And I think what I want to do is I'll just kind of read this passage here and offer a little bit of commentary as we read through it, just so I can kind of hit the points I'm trying to stress, and then anyone has anything to add, we can do that. So in Leviticus chapter 15, let's begin in verse 19 and see kind of what Moses has to say about all this. It says, "So if a woman has an issue, and if her issue in her flesh be blood," the issue of blood, right? "She will be put apart for 7 days, and anyone who touches her will be unclean until the evening." So think about this. When a woman is menstruating, when she has an issue of blood, she becomes unclean herself. And in her uncleanness, she is put away, she is put outside, because anybody who touches her will become unclean himself. So if you have a wife and your wife is on her period and you touch your wife, you become ceremonially unclean. This is the problem with the issue of blood. It goes on, verse 20. "Everything that she lies upon in her separation shall become unclean. Everything that she sits upon will be unclean." So it's not only her uncleanness spreads to people, her uncleanness spreads to everything she touches. If she lays on the bed is unclean. If you lay on the bed, now you're unclean. If she sits on the couch is unclean. You sit on the couch, now you're unclean. She has clothes that are unclean. Your clothes get mixed with her clothes, now your clothes are unclean and you're unclean. You see how this creates a really big problem? Let's continue though. It says, not only that, verse 21, "but whoever touches her bed will wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and he will be unclean until the evening. And whoever touches anything that she sat upon will wash his clothes and bathe himself in water, and he will be unclean until evening. And if it be on her bed or anything whereon she sits, if he touches it, he will be unclean until the evening. And if any man lie with her at all, and her flowers be upon him, he shall be unclean for 7 days, and all of the bed whereupon he lies shall be unclean." So you see, this is under the regular course of things. Any contact that a woman with an issue of blood has with anything makes that thing unclean, and then anybody who has contact with that thing then themselves become unclean. Okay, so this is social pariah. But let's continue. because this is normal menstruation. He's going to address abnormal issues next. Verse 25, it says, "And if a woman has an issue of her blood many days out of the time of her separation," so this is an ongoing chronic thing. This is like what the woman in our story is dealing with here in verse 25. "Beyond the time of her separation, or if it runs beyond the time of her separation, all of the days of the issue of her uncleanness will be as the days of her separation. She shall be unclean." Okay? "Every bed wherein she lies, all the days of the issue, it will be just as the bed of her separation. Whoever sits on it will be unclean, even as in her separation." Verse 27, "Whoever touches those things shall be unclean. They will wash them clothes and bathe themselves in water. They will be unclean. But," verse 28, "if she be cleansed of her issue, then it goes on, and she shall be clean, and on the 8th day she'll be clean," and then she offers the sacrifice. But what do we see in this passage? This passage, especially verse 25 to 27 or so, it's describing the woman in our story. Let's go back now to Mark chapter 5. And we see in this, in the law of Moses, which was the ceremonial law followed by the Jews in the time of Jesus, this was the case, as it were, in Jesus' day. These were the conditions that this woman was living under. She was unclean because of her bleeding. And everything she touched was unclean because of her bleeding. And anybody who touched her or anything that she had touched also became unclean because of her bleeding. And she wasn't dealing with this for 5 days. She wasn't dealing with this for a month. She was dealing with this for 12 years. Go ahead.
I can say until evening.
Because that's like the end of the day. So the way that the Jews count it is when the sun goes down, that's the beginning of a new day. So yeah, that's when at evening it's a new day, you're not unclean anymore. So this is the condition. Now imagine 12 years of this. And of course the Jews were very serious about this ceremonial cleanliness thing. They took that very, very, very seriously. And so this woman was essentially a leper. We talked about lepers and how lepers had to live outside the camp and nobody could touch them and everyone was afraid of them and they were total pariahs and nobody wanted anything to do with them. Well, that was the same exact condition this woman found herself in. Nobody wanted to touch her. If she had a husband, I'm sure her husband abandoned her because he couldn't touch her. He couldn't live with her. She couldn't live in the house. She has nobody. She has nothing. She lives in a leper colony, basically. And she, in her desperation... Well, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but any questions, any thoughts, any comments? Yeah.
I was waiting for you to get ready to say, well, why didn't Jesus follow the law of cleanliness after he's been exposed to that?
And we'll come to that. Yeah, we'll come to it. But any questions about what is said in Leviticus or kind of the social conditions? Do we understand maybe a little bit better now what's going on with this issue of blood, why this is such an issue? That's a play on words, of course, but do we understand why it's such an issue?
That might be why they took up the law while I was pregnant.
Maybe. Yeah, part of it. Yeah. Yeah, to save the pigeons. Yeah, have a baby, save the pigeons. That was the propaganda machine of the progressive wing of the Hebrews there. Yeah, Okay, so this is what we're dealing with, though. We're dealing with this woman. She's ceremonially unclean and has been in that condition for a very long time. Think about it. She doesn't get to celebrate Passover. She doesn't get to celebrate any of the feasts. She doesn't get to go into the temple. She doesn't get to make sacrifice. She doesn't get to worship God. She's unclean. She's got nothing. Nothing.
She don't even have anybody that can get close to her, basically.
Nothing.
They have to go through all this ceremony and stuff.
So this is a desperate woman. This is an outcast of society. We shouldn't miss the contrast here between the ruler of the synagogue, the most powerful, important person in the town, and then this unclean woman, whom everybody knows for the last dozen years is unclean. Don't touch her, don't go near her, because you'll be unclean if you do. And we shouldn't miss the contrast in this story between these two different people and how Jesus interacts with them. So that being said, let's see, how exactly does Jesus interact with this person? Oh, I do want to say, because Notice what it says about this woman in verse 26, that she had suffered many things from many physicians, that she spent everything that she had. She never grew better, but rather she only grew worse. Now, you'll notice Luke doesn't include that little detail. Luke himself is a physician. He leaves that part out. He doesn't talk about all the doctor stuff, all the issues that are going there. But it's important for us to understand that, the ancient world was not like the modern world when it comes to medicine. Most medicine was very superstitious in nature in that time and in that place. In the pagan world, they had all kinds of shrines and gods of healing and all kinds of rituals and potions and magical spells that someone could do to be healed. Even in the Jewish tradition, they have all kinds of various magical spells and traditions and all kinds of different remedies to issues such as this. For instance, we can read in the Talmud, one of the Jewish answers, one of the remedies to this problem of an issue of blood particularly, was if you had a woman who had this issue of blood, what she was to do was take some, I believe it's Persian onions. You need Persian onions in particular, and you need to boil them in wine and then drink the wine. And then while she's drinking the wine, it's important that a priest says, "Let this issue be dried up." That's what he has to say. And if that doesn't work, then she takes a whole assortment of herbs and spices and she boils that in some wine and then drinks that wine. And again, the priest must say the words, "Let your issue dry up." And that was the process for fixing one of these issues. Okay, so this isn't exactly the Mayo Clinic we're dealing with over here in Galilee in the first century. She spent everything she had on these superstitious efforts to heal herself. Never helped. It only made things worse. So, go ahead. Go ahead.
Didn't she sneak up behind Jesus in the crowd? If they all knew that she was unclean, why did
She would have had to cover her head.
she let everybody?
Young, I would assume that she got past them, or who she ended up on.
They moved out of the way when they saw it.
You think?
But she came up behind him.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the story in Luke, it emphasizes the same thing, that she came up behind him. And I just want to look at Matthew and see if it offers us any detail before I opine on this for a second. Let's see. I gotta find where it is.
I think the reason for that is they want to emphasize that she was sneaking, she had an intent. It wasn't that Jesus didn't know all this stuff.
Yeah, and all three of them say that she came up from behind, right? So there seems to be some sort of indication that she's trying to remain unseen. And the way that I've always conceived of this and thought about it is as her like crawling on the ground through the crowd. Because remember what it said in the beginning, he was being thronged. There was a multitude of people around him, pressing in on him, thronging him. And so she was probably able to kind of slip through unaware because of all of the excitement, but I'm sure that she was coming from behind, kind of low to the ground, trying to move through the crowd and just get to Jesus before anybody noticed what was going on. This was like a desperate attempt on her part. Because, as she's crawling through the crowd, everyone she touches is becoming unclean, right? So this is an act of desperation on her part. She sees her healing and she's going after it, and she doesn't care about any of the consequences that may come as a result of that. So,
She said out loud that when she could take his clothes, she'd be made well.
right. And so let's talk about that. This was what she had in her mind. She said in verse 28, "If I can only but touch his clothes," and some say the hem of his garment, right? This is like the focus here. If I can just touch the hem of his garment, and that's what she does. Now, some people have taken this idea of the hem of the garment, and they connect it back to a passage in Malachi chapter 4, verse 2, which talks about, it's a prophecy about the Messiah, and it says that there is going to be healing in his wings. And some people make this connection. In the time of Jesus, the rabbis used to wear like this prayer shawl. And the prayer shawl had on the hem of this garment all of these knots that were tied for the 613 commands or whatever, but it would drag out onto the ground. Jesus talked about this. The Pharisees would wear it. It had little tassels that hung off. Jesus said, oh, the Pharisees, they love to have super long tassels and to show off. This was a part of what people wore. The religious leaders, especially the rabbis and the Pharisees, they would wear this garment that drug on the ground. And people began, in that time, this garment was known as wings. And sometimes the rabbi would even hold it up like this, and it kind of looked like wings. But this little prayer shawl was referred to as the wings, or the edges, or the hems, if you will. And some people have made this connection from Malachi 4:2 that there is healing in the wings of Jesus. This woman was thinking about that prophecy. She saw the prayer shawl, the wings that Jesus was wearing, and she said, oh, if I can just touch his wings, then I'll be healed, because there's healing in his wings. Now, I personally think that we're doing a lot of reading into to come to that conclusion, but there are a lot of people who have made that connection, and so there's something interesting about that. I just thought I would bring it up and mention it. But that's what she's going for. She, at any rate, whether it's that or whether she just wants to get close to him, she does seem to have this innate faith that says, if I can just touch Jesus, if I can just make contact with him, he doesn't have to touch me on the head. He doesn't even have to know that I'm around. If I can just make contact with him, that's enough. And she had faith in that, and that's what she did, right? In fact, what does it say? Verse 28 and 29. Will somebody read that?
She felt worthy
Yeah, that's definitely part of it, right?
because of how she reacted whenever he called her out.
And we would understand why she would feel unworthy. First of all, she's a woman, and in this world, being a woman is not exactly a good thing, right? They're not exactly like high on the social status ladder, and so there's that. And then not only that, she's a Jewish woman, and so really she was even lower on the status ladder because of that and the way that she was treated in the society, especially by the elites, the religious leaders. They didn't really want contact with women, and not only was she a Jewish woman, but she was unclean. And so it's like, even if none of those things were an issue, she's like a leper. She's totally unclean. So yeah, she probably doesn't feel worthy. I don't think she has words of affirmation being spoken over her on a daily basis. I don't think for the last 12 years she's had a whole lot of people speaking life into her, making her feel real good about herself. I imagine she's at a point where she's desperate and doesn't feel very good about herself, right?
The other thing is she may have felt guilty too, because she knew what she was doing is making everybody else unclean by doing what she did.
Okay, and that's very good. So let's look at that. Let's hold that thought and let's look at this, because look at what happened. Will someone read verse 29 and 30?
Immediately the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of the affliction. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that power had gone out of him, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my clothes?
Okay, so here's a very interesting thing. Now, we have insight into what Jesus was thinking. She did not have any insight into what Jesus was thinking, right? So Mark tells us that the reason Jesus stopped is because he knew that virtue had gone out. Some of your translations will say power. Power is a better translation. Power went out from him. And he knew that. That's why he stopped. But this woman does not know that Jesus is thinking that. All she knows is that she touched this guy, and now he stopped, and he wants to know who touched him. And think about if you're her. You're unclean. This is the world-famous rabbi, the prophet, the healer, and you just touched him, which means you just made him unclean because you yourself are unclean, and everybody knows it, right? So she's probably terrified, to get back to what Chuck was just saying. Here she is, this unclean woman, and, the celebrity, the big celebrity comes to town. The famous evangelist preacher comes to town. And she just touched him, and now he's unclean. And he wants to know who touched my clothes. Go ahead.
She also must be thinking, everybody else is touching. I could possibly not say anything right now.
Okay.
And let somebody else take the blame.
I might
But
just
then
get out of here.
Something with virtue in her made her tell the truth. Come clean about it.
Okay, well, yeah, here we go. So he goes on in verse 31. It says the disciples said to him, "Bro, everybody's here. Everybody's touching you. What do you mean, who's touched you?" And he looked around and he wanted to know. And it says the woman, though, now fearing and trembling, understanding what was done in her, she came and fell down before him and told him all the truth. And I imagine this took a minute. I imagine she spilled the beans. I imagine she started back when this issue first started, probably around the age of 12 for her. I mean, I don't know that. It says she had the issue for 12 years. You know, I'm reading into that, but maybe when she was a little girl, that's when she started with this issue. And maybe that's where she started with her story and told him about all of the help that she had looked for and all that she had spent, all that she had lost, and how, she remembered hearing in synagogue as a little girl that prophecy from Malachi, there's healing in his wings, all of this stuff. I imagine they had a whole conversation. And then what does Jesus say to her at the end of that?
Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction.
Your faith has made you well. Your faith has made you whole. Go and be in peace. Now, it's interesting. This phrase that is translated as made you whole is translated from a word where in other places in the New Testament we would translate it as saved you. Your faith has saved you. Your faith has brought you salvation. It's the same word being used there. It's not the word that means like to make whole as in to complete or to perfect or any of those things. That's not really what it's saying. It's not saying you were made well in terms of you were sick and now you're made not sick anymore. What he says to her is that your faith saved you. Your faith brought you salvation. So he is going beyond her physical condition and speaking to the real condition, which is in the soul. He's going beyond the physical problem that she had, and he is speaking to the deeper issue, the deeper wound, which is the invisible wound in the soul. And he's saying, your faith, not only did it heal your body, that's a small thing, your faith has actually saved your soul. Your faith has saved you. It has made you whole. Go ahead.
Well, and he called her daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found interesting is he's being thronged by this multitude of people, but in other places where he would pass over a good state, and he healed many this. It doesn't say that here. It doesn't say that he was thronged and healed multitudes while he was thronged. So he was being touched, but I would assume that their faith was nothing like this lady.
Yeah, there's something unique going on with her. She's not the only one who was touching him. That's a great observation. But she is the only one that got healed, that we know.
That faith.
Yeah. Very interesting. That's a great observation.
I think sometimes faith and bravery can go. The one thing that she had is when he gave the person the option to come clean, she had faith because she knew that she could be healed. She touched him, she was.
Yeah.
But then she was afraid. Well, it's what you do during that fear, and your faith is brave. And
Yeah.
she come clean and told him.
That's great.
And that's what I think that faith contained the bravery.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, we see that virtue of bravery combined with faith. Bravery, not only to confess like she did, but even bravery to press through the crowd to get to him. That's an act of courage, I think. So, yeah, we see the virtue of bravery in this woman. Very good. Anything else?
Can you imagine the people, all the people that knew that she was unclean, and now she would be clean? What a testimony that would be.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And in the last couple minutes we have, I actually want to talk about that idea for just a moment while we offer a few interpretations. So this is kind of the story within a story. We set up a foundation. We saw the story about the healing. And what we've been doing as we've been looking at these is offering 4 different ways to interpret the story. The literal interpretation, the spiritual interpretation, kind of a moral interpretation, and then what we're calling the eschatological or the end times interpretation. And so looking at this story through that rubric, here's what I think about a literal interpretation. I mentioned this before, I mentioned it again. In this story, Jesus demonstrates his power over sickness. That's kind of the theme of all of these stories, and they're all pressed together, and it's showing these different aspects of Jesus demonstrating his power over these different realms. Well, in this one, he shows his power over sickness by healing the woman with the issue of blood. That's just kind of a literal interpretation of the story. Here's a spiritual interpretation. There are things in your life for which the world offers no answers. There are issues that you have. There are holes in your heart. There are wounds that are in your soul. There are problems that we all have, and we look for solutions in the world, but there are problems that we have that the world just cannot fix. And you will spend all of your money, and you will go broke, and you will not end up better on the other side of it. You will only end up worse. Because there are some things in our lives that the world simply cannot fix, but that one touch of Jesus can fix in even a moment. That's kind of a spiritual interpretation of this. A moral understanding here is sometimes it is necessary for us to take risks in order to press into Christ. I think about this woman and the risk that she was taking to press through the crowd to touch Christ. And sometimes we have to do that. Are we willing to risk looking foolish? Are we willing to risk alienating the people around us? Are we willing to risk, whatever we may be risking in order to press into Christ to get what we really need in our life from that? I want to say this too as a moral interpretation. There is nobody who is so lowly, who is so unimportant, there is nobody who doesn't matter enough that the Lord will not stop to minister to them. Jesus was on a mission with the most important person in the town, and the most outcasted woman in the town stopped Jesus in his tracks so that he could minister to her. There is nobody who is so lowly, so unworthy, so undeserving, so unlovable that Jesus will not stop to meet you where you are. He will meet us where we are, no matter who we are. And then the last moral interpretation I have here is this. Our uncleanness does not spread to Christ. We are unclean, and when we touch Christ, it's not that he becomes unclean, but rather his cleanness spreads to us. Just like we saw with the leper. When Jesus touched the leper, it didn't make Jesus unclean, it made the leper clean. When the woman with the issue of blood touches Jesus, it doesn't make Jesus unclean, it makes her clean. It dries up the issue and she becomes clean. You see, Jesus, he is not affected by our uncleanness. Rather, we become clean when we make contact with him. And then the last interpretation I have, the eschatological one, is this. In the end, in the final day, when all things are made new, all sickness, all suffering, all these things that we experience in the world, they will be healed. And like this woman with the issue of blood, we will finally be saved. We will be saved. All of our sicknesses will be made whole. We, in the end, will experience a total, complete salvation in Christ. So, this is the story of the woman of the issue of blood. We saw the overview. We walked through the details. We saw a few interpretations. As we come to a close, does anybody have any final comments, questions, anything as we come to a close? Well, very good. I hope that you all have enjoyed looking at this. Next week, Lord willing, we're going to come back and we're going to finish the story by looking at the second half when Jesus picks back up and goes with Jairus to visit his daughter and to raise her up. We're going to walk through that half of the story in detail. We're going to look at some of the things that are out there and offer a few interpretations for that part of the story. But if there's nothing else for tonight, we're going to go ahead and come to a close. Brother Chuck, will you close us in prayer this evening?